Hey everybody, it's Chuck Dixon again. Hope this finds you well and happy and safe during our current crisis. Um, let's all hope the next crisis is a little bit more fun than this one was. Um, Back here again to answer your questions. You're kindly put on Facebook in response to my request. And let's get right to it. Jared Mitchell. Hey, Jared. Jared is my biographer and statistician. This is the man, the Reverend Jared Mitchell, who ran the numbers to prove uh, substantially that I am the most prolific writer ever to write comics, which surprised me more than anyone else, I think, because it never seemed like work. Anyway, Jared Mitchell asks, what gives you the greatest joy in writing comics? Have you ever been brought to tears when writing a particular comic or character? Um, the greatest joy to me in writing comics is sitting here by myself making stuff up. Um, it comes from many, many years of daydreaming in school, particularly math class. And I was able to take that daydreaming and turn it into cash by becoming a professional writer. Um, Denny O'Neil once told me that there's a lot of reasons for getting into creative fields. And the only one that leads to success is enjoying doing the creating, enduring the loneliness, embracing the isolation, and just doing the stuff. Taking that life of your mind, that crazy stuff that occupies your head, and getting it down on paper for others to read. He said that was the way to go. He said everyone that he knew who had gotten into the comic business for the wrong reasons didn't last long, and the ones who just enjoyed creating stood the test of time. So, and I can attest that's true. I've been doing this 35 plus years, and I'm still here, all by myself. Anyway, um, now have I ever been brought to tears? Jared already knows the answer to this one. I used to write children's books before I got into comics. Not my first choice of fields. And I wrote a little book, a little golden book called Raggedy Ann and Andy Go Flying. And I wrote it under the name Mary J. Fulton, which was my grandmother's maiden name. So, because they said nobody would buy a Raggedy Ann and Andy book written by a man, even though Raggedy Ann and Andy were created by a man, Johnny Gruel. Um, anyway, in a moment of weakness, and another one's coming, I, I admitted to Jared that my eyes teared up when writing this because Raggy and Andy are just so polite and so nice and so sweet and so loyal to one another that it touched me while I was writing the story. So there you go. Uh, you know, Legendary, supposedly tough guy writer. Can't handle Raggedy Ann and Andy. I never cried while writing The Punisher or Batman, though, I must confess. So, okay, our next question. Have you ever experienced writer's block? What's your personal safe bet for getting out of it? Okay. When you're working under deadline, when you're a professional writer or a professional artist, you have homework all the time. And it can be an uncomfortable feeling unless you embrace it. When I was a kid, I think this happens, well, I don't know if it happens anymore, but it happened when I was a kid. uh, when you went away for Christmas break or Easter break, the teachers always gave you an assignment, to be done, to be handed in when you got back. I was the kid who came home the first day, that afternoon, sat down and did the assignment so I didn't have to think about it over Christmas or over Easter. Other kids would be like, oh, they'd have it hanging over them all the time. I didn't like that feeling. So I just did it first, got it out of the way, enjoyed my holidays. And I think I unconsciously carried that philosophy over into my freelance life. I always work way ahead of schedule. I don't so much anymore because, quite frankly, the cash flow from indie publishing is not the same as when I worked at DC and Marvel. You could literally work a year ahead at DC, but that's all. Because I remember getting a phone call from Bob Greenberger saying, "You're too far ahead. We can't pay you. You're into next year's. You're deep into next year's budget. I can't justify paying you. You're gonna have to wait a couple of months for this paycheck." And I'm like, "Fine." And he's like, "Slow down, slow down." Um, uh, so yeah, if you work far ahead, you see, writer's block only comes from the pressure of the deadline, I think. Um, because if you're not under a deadline, you simply have an idea for a story and you sort of run dry. You just put it aside and come back to it. That's not writer's block. That's just you're working on the story incrementally. Any of you professional writers will attest that you've had stories in your head that you've worked on literally for years, um, putting them together, putting the puzzle pieces together, looking for inspiration, or inspiration comes unbidden, and you go, "Oh, that's a good idea for that story I have in, that file drawer in my head, way in the back." Uh, and so, yeah, but if if you have deadlines, beat them. And when you're on a roll, stay on the roll. I mentioned writing a year ahead. Well, that happened on a book called Nightwing, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But Nightwing, I was a year ahead, for a year and a half. I stayed a year ahead on that book, as far as scripts. So if you have the luxury of time, your writer's block should not rear its ugly head because you're not in any kind of not under any kind of pressure. You can also talk yourself into writer's block. I'll never get an idea for this. You can't think that. You will get an idea for it. And that's one thing I've learned to have faith in the longer I write is the idea will come. Don't worry about it. Editors used to call, they used to have this little round, I think, on Friday afternoons. They'd call all the freelancers they hadn't talked to earlier in the week. And they'd always have notes, could you change this? Could you change that? And I finally trained all of my editors never to call me on a Friday afternoon. Because what that meant was I'd just be thinking about what you said all weekend. And I wanted to take the weekend off. I need some downtime. So if you call on Friday and say, I think we should change this character to a girl, that's all I'm going to think about all weekend. And horror of horrors, I might actually sit down on a Saturday afternoon and write what you asked me to write, make the changes. It's just totally unfair. So I trained all my editors not to do that. So yeah, that's it. Don't talk yourself in the writer's block. It's an attitude. It's not even a state of mind. It's just an attitude. Avoid it at all costs. Don't believe in it. Don't participate in writer's block. Next question. Tim Kretzer. He's a two-parter, if that's allowed. We'll see. What kind of positive changes do you see the comic book industry having coming out of the big pause? I like that. And two, what kind of changes would you personally like to see? Um, well, the biggest change is, you know, um, someone I know who's deeply involved with e-publishing told me that there was a 20% rise in the readership of ebooks. And this is easily measurable. It's the numbers that uh, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and the rest use. I mean, they know the numbers. They know how many people are reading. They even know how many pages people are reading. And there's a 20% rise in Kindle readership. I have to think that that would carry over to comics as well. Because you can't, if you really love comics and you got to have your comics fix every week and you can't go to the comic shop, and well, literally your comics are sitting at Diamond, unable to be delivered. You've got nowhere else to turn but your own collection to reread stuff, or go to the Kindle or the Nook or online to read comics. If readership is up 20% uh, on e-comic books, and I suspect it would even be higher, because let's face it, if you're reading prose novels, you've always had access to them. You probably were already in the habit. You're simply reading them 20% more because you have the downtime. You're not, because of the coronavirus, perhaps you aren't going to work. And so you've got a lot of spare time. You're spending it reading. Comics, on the other hand, you can't get them, and a lot of people weren't in the ebook habit, may have started the ebook habit and reading comics digitally. Um, so I suspect the numbers for comics are even higher than for prose novels. This would be an encouraging sign. It would certainly be a boost in the arm to digital comics, which has always been more of a promise than a reality. Um, many people do read digital comics. I know that from my own royalty statements. But it goes up and down, and there's no real trend that I can see where it's rising. It kind of peaked um, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and it's been up and down since then. But yeah, you know that's a kind of positive change. And I'd like to see that because I think comics should be more readily available, and this absolutely does make them readily available. And there's other aspects too. There's Webtoon, which is an online comic service or an app actually, and you can get it on any mobile device. And it's comics. They're read slightly different. You sort of scroll down. It's an interesting medium. I'm working in it now. I'm working on 2 different series that will show up on Webtoon, and I actually have a lot of material from Archaven Comics that has been reformatted for Webtoon, and it's free. My series Amazon or not Amazon, my series Avalon, and my adaptation of Right Ho Jeeves by P.G. Woodhouse are both available on Webtoon for free. Uh, and they fit very well reformatted. It's an interesting venue. It's if you're a comics fan and really love the medium, it's worth a look. It's kind of different, and I'm enjoying writing for this format, which I didn't think I would. I've sort of adapted what I do to this, and I found some artists with some really inventive ways of really making this new medium click. But I assume that Webtoon as well has had a spike in readership, although Webtoon is very healthy with 50 million subscribers worldwide. So let's not worry about that. They seem to be doing all right. Okay, Bob Deese, the maven of manly publishing. Bob publishes a lot of great books. Uh, reprint material from the men's sweat magazines of the late 50s and early 60s. That great, I fought an entire Japanese battalion and lived to tell about it, that kind of stuff. He has some really jaw-dropping art books that he publishes with art from that period by some of the greats, Mort Kunstler, guys like that. Anyway, Bob says you've created so many different characters and so many different scenarios and worlds and comics and novels. How do you keep all the details about them and their histories and their environments they exist in all straight while you write sequels? By rereading your previous stories, keeping notes about them, creating Bibles for them, by having a superhuman memory, some other system? Well, yeah, all of the above. Um, it's Yeah, people ask me this all the time. In addition to how do you shift gears? I mean, how do you go from writing SpongeBob, to writing Levon Cade? You know, um, I just do. I just sort of, I get. Bob Burden once said that comic book writers use the wrong parts of their brains, and I think he's right in a way. He's being facetious, but I think he's right. Um, we just use a different part of our brain than normal people. So yeah, I less and less can I rely on my superhuman memory. So I have started taking notes more in the last few years, and I have to reread my stuff. That was the thing when I started writing novels. I didn't know they would continue on as long as they did. Writing book 6, book 7, book 8. Um, so I do have to go back and reread. Thank God for the find feature in Word, so I can look for people's names and I make copious notes. My desk is covered in Post-it notes. with lists of characters' names and things, um, because it's I just simply can't remember the hundreds of characters' names anymore. I used to, but the memory fades as one gets old and older. Not old. I don't feel old. I'm still a kid. I write comic books, for God's sakes. I'm never going to grow up. So yeah, notes and what's really helpful is I borrowed this tip from Sergio Cariello, my artist friend. I have a second monitor set up vertically next to my main monitor, and I can put previous scripts or outlines up on that. It's particularly handy when I'm doing adaptation work. I can literally put the novel up on the screen to my right while I'm writing the adaptation script. It's a lot better than fumbling with a book open in my lap. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. It's basically, Bob, it's all of the above. Just everything I can possibly do to keep those things straight in my mind as I make up new stuff. And let's see, where are we going now? Douglas Eugene Rockstead Jr. When you write a series as opposed to a single one-shot or issue or story arc, how do you break down the overlapping plots and story arcs that span many issues? What is your process for tracking timeliness and story development? Um, well, you kind of there's a lot of people, when the trade paperbacks began to rear their head, I guess in the 90s, when more and more comics were being collected into paperback, and there was obviously an audience for the paperback, and then the growing trend of waiting for the paperback. A lot of discussion was done about how to write for the trade, quote unquote. How do you write for the trade? How do you write it so that each one of these trade paperbacks is a satisfying reading experience and still serve the needs of the monthly reader? And I remember a lot of discussions with Scott Peterson and Darren Vincenzo, particularly about this. And what came out of those discussions was the first year of Nightwing. Nightwing keeps coming up here, and then will come up more in questions coming up. But it was basically breaking the year of comics down into two trade paperbacks, ultimately. So you had two 6-issue story arcs. But I never treated, and Scott and Darren agreed with me, we never treated it as if it was one big story. It was one big story with 6 parts, so that the monthly reader would get the satisfying reading experience. And so that's how I designed the issues, based on our discussions about that, where it didn't, to the monthly reader, it didn't seem like they were getting 2 episodes a year, if you know what I mean. They were getting 12 episodes of a story. And, each issue would have payoffs, subplots that, resolved or began or came to an end. And by issue 6, a lot of things had been resolved, but other things had been left open. Not necessarily, final episode of Dallas kind of cliffhanger, but enough story elements to continue on, which is what comics do. It's a periodical, comes out every month. The stories last for years, but you'd have this first 6 issues, which could be included in a trade, that told a complete story, all the subplots wrapped up. Even if you had single issue stories or 2-issue arcs within those 6 issues, these subplots, the spine of the story, kind of wrapped up and resolved. And then the next one you'd pick up again. So yeah, and a lot of that is stuff you really have to do in your head. Well, at least most people do. I remember at the Bat Summits, because we had 3 writers and sometimes 4 writers, and we were dealing with multiple monthly issues that all had to tie together into a single story, like Nightfall or Contagion. We would have whiteboards, these whiteboards. And I remember Jordan writing on the whiteboards as we said things. And we would make all these notes, and then other whiteboards, we would lay out each issue, what had to happen in them. And that's when Denny introduced to us something that Paul Levitz had borrowed from the soap operas, which was ABC plotting. In a soap opera, if you watch soap operas, there's always a story beginning, there's a story in the middle, and there's a story in the end. That's how the subplots run, so that you have a seamless continuity where there's always something happening. There's always something resolving, there's always something beginning, and there's always something in the middle to engage you. And that's how they write soap operas. And Paul Levitz had promoted at DC adopting this kind of thing for comics. And I think one of the things like Legion of Superheroes and Teen Titans, where you had these enormous ensemble casts, it fit perfectly. And Denny thought that it would fit perfectly for these massive story arcs we were doing, and it did. It did. We used ABC plotting, and it keeps things going. It makes it seem like the story is never going to end because you're always introducing new elements. Um, Now, those are company-wide crossovers, but you know, because I was on a number of titles at a time at DC, I was able to do crossovers on my own. This one was Brotherhood of the Fist, and it was actually Brotherhood of the Monkey Fist in my mind, but they didn't want to have that in the title. This was my big martial arts epic. It ran through Green Arrow, Nightwing, Robin, and Detective for 5 issues, I believe. And the cause for it was we were finally going to have the showdown. Who is the greatest martial artist in the DC universe? And all of the principal martial art characters show up in this arc. It's all written by me. It's all different artists, and I kind of I had to hold a mini summit with myself, to lay it all out. But I knew where I was going, and I knew ultimately how I wanted it to end. So it was relatively easy. I think the only um, downside of it was I can't remember if Graham Nolan worked on this with me or not. Um, was I'm not a martial artist, and kind of helping the artist through all of this, figuring out all the moves and all that jazz. That was probably the biggest challenge. I think I just suggested movies and for them to watch, but everybody did a terrific job on it. But this was one that I had the ABC plot on my own, and it was an interesting experience. And I think I did it on a couple of other titles. When you're writing 4 titles a month at the same company, um, there's an urge, to merge the titles, and I pretty much did merge the continuity of my 4 titles, whichever ones they were, and that's when I coined the term the Dixon verse, because they all existed in my version, my little corner of the DCU. So anyway, let's move on to the next question. Why are you the most underappreciated Batman writer? I, you know, there's a number of reasons for that. Number one is my model for writing comics was always Archie Goodwin, and Archie was, you know, a fan of the medium and became a pro, and really learned quickly. I mean, the guy had a sharp learning curve writing for Warren Comics, and his thing was that um, a balance between the words and the pictures. Let the artist tell the story. And this is the first writer that I actually paid attention to. When I was a kid, I was like, wow, this guy, I like this stuff. All these stories that this guy wrote, I like, and I'm going to follow him wherever he goes. I'm going to follow him, and I did. I followed him over to Marvel, and I followed his career everywhere. And but by concentrating on letting the artist tell the story and mostly staying out of the way, only having enough words to, make the story clear to the reader, only having enough dialogue to get across the emotion and exposition needed to make a story click. By doing this, Archie um, was in the invisible hand school of writing. And that's pretty much where I am. That's the invisible hand. I don't want you to pay attention to the writing. I don't even want you to pay attention to the story. I want you to read this thing as an experience. If I've done my job and I do sweat over this, you'll read the story as an experience rather than a story. Because once a person realizes they're reading a story, they try to anticipate what's going to happen next, or they're simply taken out of it. It's not an immediate experience. It's not a fully engaging experience if you know you're, you know, watching or reading a story. So I'm still telling a story, but I don't want you to know that, if that makes any sense at all. And that's pretty much invisible handwriting. Now, the more celebrated writers of Batman, and there's a lot of underappreciated Batman writers, in my opinion. Frank Robbins would be one. Um, you know, Alan Brenner would be another one. I could sit here and list them all day. A lot of people have written Batman, and a lot of people have been underappreciated. But anyway, the I don't call attention to my writing. That's basically what invisible handwriting is. You're not drawing the reader's attention to your writing in a way that like an Alan Moore or a Grant Morrison does, and that's fine. That's what they do. That's their thing. Okay, that's how they made their bones, and that's not a problem. They've invested themselves in their work far more than I'm comfortable with. Um, the greatest compliment I can ever get from a fan is, I was going through all my comics and I didn't realize how many I had written by you. That pleases me more than anything else because it means they liked the story. They weren't just, actively seeking out Chuck Dixon comics. They just got in the habit of buying my work because they liked what they were reading. So another reason I'm underappreciated is, quite frankly, I was blacklisted at DC until recently, and the guy in charge, the head honcho, um, only ever reluctantly published my work, reprinted it, and actually ended a reprint program because he just got sick of seeing my name. So, because I did a lot of work at DC, there's a lot of stuff there to reprint, and when it's reprinted, it's generally profitable. Uh, I just noticed now on Amazon, my name will be appearing on the cover of trade collections again. My name has not appeared on a cover of a trade collection in many, 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 many years. It's like reluctant publishing as opposed to redundant publishing. So yeah, there's a passive reason, invisible handwriting, that I'm not as, celebrated. And then there's an active reason why that happened. And I'm happy either way. I really, I, you know, didn't get into comics to be famous. That's like the woman who tries to make it in Hollywood by sleeping with the writers. I mean, it's not. It wasn't what I got into comics to do. Like I said before, I got into comics because I like making stuff up. So, but thank you for the thought and the sympathy, or whatever that question implied. All right, Will Abbott says, at one point you were writing so many books at once. How did you organize the workload? Did you schedule certain days for certain books? Okay, this kind of touches on some of the earlier questions. Um, as I said earlier, when you get on a roll, stay on the roll. So I might spend the whole month just writing one book. And I found out that when John Byrne was in his run at Marvel, where he was writing and drawing two monthlies, that's what he did. He spent half the year on Fantastic Four and half the year on She-Hulk. Literally concentrating on one title at a time. I had four titles and sometimes more to do a month, so I couldn't do that. But if I stayed far enough ahead of schedule, I could spend a month or more bearing down on one book if I got on a roll. That's what happened with Nightwing. I wrote almost nothing but Nightwing for almost, I don't know, maybe 2 months, almost 3 months. And I wrote the first 12 issues of Nightwing, one after the other. And I could only do this because I was so far ahead on Green Arrow, Robin, and Detective, and all the other work that I was doing on the side. So it was a great writing experience. I never got bored. Um, and by writing the first 12 issues, and by the way, I was done with the first 12 issues before Scott McDaniel ever laid a pencil to paper on issue one. So I was able to write all 12 issues, and then my editor was Scott Peterson again, and um, you know, in a lot of discussions with him, we were able to go back because I was so far ahead, and no art had been done. We were free to make any changes we wanted. So we went back and really tightened up stuff and caught continuity glitches and made changes and moved events around so that those 12 issues read as one huge epic story, divided into two epic um, trade paperbacks. And it was really the first time um, that I'm aware of that anyone approached it like that. Maybe others did, and I don't know about it, but we really were thinking about the trades, as I said in an earlier answer, I should say, and we were really thinking that way. And this is the only time I ever did this, and it really, people still talk about that run, and I think that's because of all the luxury of time we had and the extra work we were able to put into it. And you know, that's how that happened. So thank you, Scott Peterson. Thank you, Scott McDaniel. All right. R.B. Probst writes, when you created Actuary, did you see him as a one-off character for that particular story, or did you see him as someone that could last and become a more prominent member of the Rose Gallery? I think you only used him one other time after his introduction, so that may be the answer. Or did I guess? Or I guess it could be a sign of what editorial thought of him. The Actuary was a character he was an insurance actuary. His job was evaluating risk, and he decided to go freelance and do the same for criminals. He offered his services that if you were going to do a heist or whatever, he would figure out the best time of day, the best time of year, the best weather conditions, all these things from past data to show what to show you, well, this crime, you know, perpetrated in this way has an 89% chance of success. And of course, Batman and Robin were always the monkey wrench, the imponderables in his equations. And I introduced him in his own, I think I introduced him in his own storyline. And my intention was to have him a background character, utility character that I could use now and then, either for a joke or, whatever. I never saw him as a main uh, member of Batman's Rose Gallery. He was never intended to be that. He was an ancillary character on the criminal side. When I worked on the Batman books, I was trying to build up a cast of characters for the Gotham underworld beyond just the main villains. I didn't like the idea of each villain having their nameless henchmen, and nameless henchmen are not interesting, and they don't seem like a challenge for the good guys at all because they're red shirts, they're straw men, you know. They're there's an equivalent in gaming, and I can't recall that. I'm not into gaming that much, so I can't recall. But non-personality characters, is that what they are? And so I wanted to populate the Gotham underworld with, you know, more personalities, a la like Goodfellas, or something like that, where there were more interesting characters, and there was more of it wasn't just chaotic. There was more of a power structure. People had tasks. I mean, if you read anything about organized crime, there's jobs. There's you. This is your job. Your job is to go collect debts, and you take along this guy because his job is to break someone's legs if they don't pay up. You know, so I wanted to show that kind of hierarchy in the underworld. Actuary was a part of it. And yeah, I never got back to him, but I would have. So anyway, that's it for questions for this session. I have a series at Archaven Comics called Alt Hero Q. It's kind of my James Bond. Uh, this guy Roland Dane. He's a former Treasury agent, and he fights against global conspiracies, much like Bond did after the Soviet Union fell. Uh, so it's a fun series. He's a bit of a slob hero. He's no James Bond. He does drive through and he doesn't make his bed. So, but it's fun. It's action packed. It's a 6-issue miniseries. I think 2 issues are available right now on Amazon in paper and on Kindle. Anyway, thanks for listening. I got more questions down the road, and we'll get to them. See you then. Chuck Dixon out.